Hi, everyone, and welcome to this second meeting of two meetings on the resurgence of the far right in Canada. I'm Todd Gordon, and I'm an editor of Midnight Sun and the author of an article in that publication on the far right's resurgence called "Fascism is as Canadian as Maple Leaf." I'm also one of the organizers for today's event, and I live in Toronto. So this event is being hosted by Alberta Advantage, Briarpatch, Upping the Ante, and Midnight Sun, and it's endorsed by Between the Lines and Canadian Dimension. Our first meeting a few weeks ago, we discussed the reemergence of the far right today, who's involved, what's driving it, how it connects to the international resurgence of far right politics, its connection to anti-disability politics and eugenics, among other things. And the recording of it is available on the Eventbrite and social media publicity for today's meetings. If you haven't had an opportunity to look at it, I'd encourage you to do so. In today's meeting, we're going to talk with some anti-fascist and anti-far right organizers from 4 different cities across the country about the far right in their respective cities, as well as about the anti-fascist, anti-far right organizing that they've been a part of, its successes and its challenges, strategies and tactics in the building of their movements against the far right, among other things. The first part of the meeting is organized as a roundtable. The event organizers have come up with a series of questions that we're going to pose to our roundtable guests to help explore the issues that we're focusing on today. In the second part, we're going to open it up to everyone in attendance for questions and comments that they have. Before we go any further, a couple points on our format today. So first, it's being recorded and live streamed. We plan on making the recording available to folks who were not able to make it today. Because we're using the webinar format, no one besides myself and our roundtable participants are visible. This also means that attendees won't be able to verbally ask questions or make comments. We'll be using the question and answer function. So if you have questions or comments that you'd like to make, please submit them that way through the question and answer. And we have our organizers of the event who will be monitoring this. And you can also choose to remain anonymous when you submit your questions, if that's your preference. And we'll do our best to get to as many questions and comments as possible. Obviously, we have a limited time, but we will endeavor to try to get as many of those questions answered and comments responded to. So obviously, also to make the roundtable today manageable, we couldn't have organizers against the far right from every city where that organizing is happening. So if you've got experiences from your city where you're located or where you're organizing, feel free to post them in the chat. And if you have information about the groups doing anti-far right or anti-fascist organizing in your city, and you would like to share that, because there might be other people from your city where you're located, or maybe there's other people across the country who are curious to know what kind of organizing is going on in different cities, then please feel free to share that in the chat as well. It's also really important to note here when discussing the far right and its white supremacist reactionary politics that we're all on Indigenous land today. Canada is a settler colonial society founded on a project of white supremacy, and Canada's ongoing existence is predicated on that racist and colonial project, a militarized project of dispossession and denial of sovereignty to Indigenous peoples. And any discussion of the far right in Canada should be grounded in that recognition and in that long arc of Canadian history, which shapes its present. And that history, as I'm sure we're aware, is fertile ground for reactionary racist politics and movements, of which the far right is one particular manifestation of that. So I want to introduce our roundtable guests, and then we'll get into our roundtable questions for them. So first, from Vancouver, we have Imtiaz Papat. Imtiaz is a therapeutic counselor and a co-founder of the Coalition Against Bigotry Pacific and the community-based anti-hate task force. He's been an advocate for social and ecological justice and has organized protests against racism and bigotry and against LNG, liquefied natural gas, and the Site C Dam, as well as protests in support of LGBT rights and animal welfare. Joining us from Calgary is Rory Gillies, and Rory is a writer and researcher for the Alberta Advantage podcast. In Ottawa is Chelsea Fluke. Chelsea works for the Public Service Alliance of Canada, or PSAC. She helped with the creation of a network of organizations working to oppose the Freedom Convoy in Ottawa and to mobilize the labor movement in response to the Freedom Convoy. And in Montreal, we have Nick Barry-Shaw. Nick is an author, researcher, and Haiti solidarity activist. He's the trade and privatization campaigner with the Council of Canadians and is working on a book with Bérenger Ensemble about Quebec's turn to identitaire politics. So welcome to our roundtable guests. We're really happy to have you join us today and be part of this important and what we hope is a helpful and constructive discussion for everyone here, yourselves and our attendees. So I'll just jump in with our first question for you. And so we talked in general at our first, after the Convoy event, about the far right's resurgence in Canada across the country, obviously inspired by the Freedom Convoy. So just to start, can you folks please explain the present day terrain of the far right in your specific cities? So for example, how frequently does it organize rallies? What kinds of numbers in general is the far right getting in your cities? And perhaps what's the highest numbers if you can, make sort of estimate for us? How well organized would you say they are? And are there identifiable groups that are leading it? And lastly, as part of this first question, how has the Freedom Convoy movement affected the far right's organizing in your city? So maybe we'll just start first for this first question. We'll go say Montreal east and then move west. So Nick, if you want to take a stab at some of those questions.
Yeah, thanks for the intro, Todd. I guess I would start by saying that Montreal and Quebec, as usual, is kind of an outlier on these questions. I would start with the question about the convoy. I think the impact of the convoy hasn't been the same as it's been in the rest of Canada. In Quebec, and that the far right today is actually in some ways much weaker than it was maybe 4 or 5 years ago when it really peaked in 2017, 2018. But in other ways, it's gotten stronger. So I guess, to start with, there's a kind of endless number of far right groups that you could list off if you wanted to go down the list. There's Storm Alliance that organized quite a bit. Soldiers of Odin was active for a while. Pegida Quebec, the Fédération des Québécois de Souche, which is like the Federation of Old Stock Quebecers, which was founded by neo-Nazis. And there's groups that are kind of more like neo-Nazi groups, like more straightforwardly neo-Nazi, like Atalante Quebec, and they've done a lot of kind of tried to do shocking actions, in one case invading the offices of Vice magazine, and basically proffering threats to journalists and so on. So they're kind of on the more thuggish end of the far right spectrum. But I think in Quebec, probably the group that attained the biggest notoriety and had the biggest popular base until recently would have been La Meute, so the Wolf Pack. This was a group that was founded in 2015. It was founded by 2 ex-soldiers, and I think it grew pretty quickly from an online group from and into an organized, basically quasi kind of paramilitary group, very highly centralized structure befitting an organization founded by ex-soldiers. And it was organizing demonstrations in Quebec, that a couple thousand, many hundreds at the very least, on a regular basis. And at their peak, they had on their Facebook page about 60,000 followers. Obviously, that was not, members or people who are active in the organization, but anti-fascist organizers estimated their strength to be still about 3,000 to 4,000 active members. So that is, they were, I think, justifiably recognized as a very big threat. They were very focused on Islam. Understandably, these guys were vets from Afghanistan and had latched on to the kind of toxic Islamophobia that had been washing over the province since the reasonable accommodations debate in 2006, 2007. But they kind of, we're lucky in the sense that they they weren't able to work out like a stable organization. There were tons of internal conflicts, and basically before the convoy hit, La Meute kind of split into these different factions, and so the founding members are not there anymore. There's this offshoot group, Les Farfadas, that is active and has been involved in the kind of convoy support protests that have happened in Quebec. There was a very big one in Quebec City around the time when the convoy was happening. There were other groups that were present on the far right that were there and that have been pretty involved in convoy and anti-lockdown protests. Citoyens au pouvoir is one group, and there's like a kind of notorious construction worker, construction union leader, Rambo Gauthier, who was there and who's been involved in that. So I think the far right is trying to use the momentum of the convoys to pull itself back together, but they kind of mostly through their own incompetence and infighting have been pretty disorganized in the last couple of years, and were pretty quiet until recently. So they're hoping to kind of get reorganized with the convoy, but it's not clear. So that's the sense in which they're weaker. And I'll just say very quickly the one sense in which they're stronger, which is the development of the Parti conservateur du Québec, so the Conservative Party of Quebec. In government right now, we have the Coalition Avenir du Québec, which is already pretty much a conservative party in power. The PCQ was until recently a kind of tiny libertarian offshoot. They had maybe 500 members, and they've latched on to the convoy, and they've grown enormously. So they have now 57,000 members. They have a leader who is very media savvy in Eric Duhaime. And although they're completely focused on the kind of anti-lockdown politics for the moment, it's, if you read their program, they're very much in line with the kind of anti-immigrant, anti-Islam politics that have dominated Quebec for the last decade and a half or so. So I think the presence of the PCQ, the growing strength, I think they're polling around 16 or 17% right now. They've really done what the Popular Party of Canada hasn't been able to do, which is split off significant layers of support of people who were frustrated with the pandemic, who didn't believe it was a real thing or were fully conspiracy theorists, and they've mobilized them and organized them into a support base. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens with them. But I think that's one sense in which the far right in Quebec is stronger than in the rest of Canada.
Thank you. And when just a note, you said peel off a significant number of people from the Popular Party. I think you meant the People's Party.
The PCQ has probably peeled off a lot of support from the CAQ, from the
right, in the way that the People's Party hadn't from the outside of Quebec.
Yeah, whereas the People's Party, from what I've seen, they haven't been able to split off significant number of supporters from the Conservatives as of yet.
Thank you. So moving west, Chelsea, can you just give us a brief sense of the far right terrain in Ottawa?
Yeah, for sure. And thanks for having me here. I want to also preface this that I moved to Ottawa in 2019, which was right before the United We Roll rolling in. So got here a month before that. And so the terrain, you know, for me as a relatively newer person to the city, I spoke with some folks who were involved in organizing in the city against fascists in the lead up to this to try to gather some info and, you know, things to share, just because I want to recognize that some of these questions about did the convoy make them get bigger, what happened, as like, well, I don't really know. But I mean, you know, for one thing, you know, there were sort of local groups. They would have rallies. They would have maybe 30 or 40 people. You can kind of tell that they're local groups because it's maybe on a weekday, maybe happening. You know, it's only 30 or 40 people. But the you know, the main thing is to try to think about how has the convoy affected their numbers. It's really a bit hard to tell. There's some groups that are still, for example, going through the Byward Market in like maybe 20 to 40 strong on certain nights. But by and large, a lot of the local organizing has kind of been eclipsed and overtaken by this sort of national convoy roll-in situation, either of the original trucker convoy to the you know, Rolling Thunder, which just happened recently. And so if we were to talk a bit about a sense of local numbers, it's harder to tell. Did they get bigger? Did they not? A lot of the groups, you know, that were already mentioned, you know, the sort of Canada First, there's a bunch of them that were in town. They came from out of town. They're all here. We did actually at work, we had a lead up to a strike situation at the office of the Auditor General, and we ran into one of the groups. This is before the Freedom Convoy, and that's where I saw about 30 or so people. They were protesting, you know, it was kind of this confluence of anti-vax, anti-mandate, anti-lockdown folks. They were protesting outside the CBC. They actually saw our picket and came and harassed us for a bit. You know, but at the time, you know, 30 or 40 people wasn't so difficult to deal with compared to what we all, I think, saw in the Freedom Convoy trucker version, which was, you know, sometimes upwards of thousands of people in the streets coming in on weekends, especially is when we would see a big volume of people coming in. But in terms of the local organizing, it's not as clear. You know, and then one of the people I talked to about, you know, 5 years ago around the 2017, 2018 timelines, like, yeah, there was Proud Boys, Soldiers of Odin. They were trying to, again, hold their rallies on Parliament Hill. I was told that, you know, they'd show up, maybe they were about 30 or 40 people then. So again, more fringe, more, not like the trucker convoy. And yeah, and so it was interesting in that timeline to watch their numbers swell and watch people come in for weekend support and flags, you know, all over their trucks, all over their cars, things like that. But I think it's a bit too early to tell about whether this has led to a lot of local recruitment. I think that there's a difference between joining a group actively versus sort of going in and visiting the bouncy castles kind of thing. But it's a bit of a wait and see.
Thank you very much. Rory, can you give us a sense of the training Calgary, please?
Yeah, so the sort of main historical continuity between what's happening now and what's happened before is Calgary had a lot of the sort of yellow vest Unite We Roll campaign from early 2019. That's where I think a lot of the organizing figures of this current iteration came from. Also, there's some other important figures. So like that Pastor Artur Pawlowski and his street church has actually had like a history of connecting with hate groups in Calgary. Like certainly as early as 2017 in spring, summer, there was a number of rallies by the far right in Calgary kind of after the Trump's victory in the United States. And that was kind of, so there were counter demonstrations that we organized against that, and the far right just kind of splintered and became disorganized. As well as like there had been about 10 to 15 years ago, there have been a number of like more, I guess, like classic neo-Nazi groups that had rallied in Calgary, but they were again, like faced counter protests by anti-racist groups, and that ended. So in some senses, the far right wasn't too well organized in Calgary until about 2019, when you saw the United We Roll convoy. That kind of petered out a bit after that convoy went to Ottawa and spent its weekend there, and then came back without really doing all that much in some respects. But they sort of got the band back together in like late January, early February 2020 to actually try and break a picket line of locked out oil refinery workers who had been locked up at the Federated Co-ops Limited in refinery in Regina, but there was a card lock, which is essentially just like a large like gas station and storage facility in Carsland, Alberta, which is about 45 minutes southeast of the city. They came with their big rigs and like drove across the picket line with the support of management. It was kind of really like highlighted the like strong like anti-labor part of them. So the current iteration sort of comes from like late 2020, when you start getting some rallies against the restrictions. There wasn't really a lot of any counter protests to them because most people were kind of staying home and avoiding contact. Sorry, so they were kind of able to use this to like organize in public and without any real like street level opposition. They mostly kind of marched around in some of the parks in central Calgary. We did see like definitely like anti-mandate rallies with the Proud Boys would show up, Soldiers of Odin, etc., and people who were like known or at least former members of the Aryan Guard, and even some like strange decisions they had in spring and summer 2021. They did like a tiki torch rally in both Calgary and Edmonton, apparently in connection to what happened in Charlottesville in the United States in 2017. And basically this began to take the form of like kind of in mid 2021, like the form of like weekly Saturday protests, which kind of moved around from different locations within central Calgary, but eventually settled in this park in the inner city called Memorial Park, which is a library, and it's also right across from a hospital where they would harass healthcare workers about vaccines and the mandates and that sort of thing. And they had then developed into a march where they would march down 17th Avenue in this neighborhood called Beltline, which is just south of the downtown. 17th Avenue or in Beltline is basically a sort of commercial strip with a lot of stores and restaurants and bars, as well as a lot of residents who live in apartment buildings and condos. Their numbers kind of like varied, but sort of with the Freedom Convoy to Ottawa and the occupation that happened there, their numbers surged a lot. So some of their weekly marches, I think they had maxed out at probably about 5,000 people, but they could generally vary between like 1,000 to 3,000. This would be in like February and into March. And what you had was a lot of people who lived in Calgary suburbs or even from out of town would drive in to participate in these marches. And interestingly, these were actually mostly like pedestrian events. Like there wasn't really a lot of trucks or vehicles or big rigs that would come in. People would show up for a rally in Memorial Park, and then they would just march down 17th Avenue. There'd be a few like vehicles that would participate, and particularly they really took up like a lot of honking in response to the convoy doing that in Ottawa. There were people who would get like train horns on hockey sticks and just like honk these things really, really loudly. And kind of what the intent of like these marches was to just basically like disrupt and intimidate people in the neighborhood. And this went on for months.
Thank you very much. Imtiaz, can you give us a little bit of the background on the terrain in Vancouver for the far right now?
Yeah, so we started our coalition work in December 2016. This is right around the rise of Trump. I guess a lot of people have experienced. That's where people were emboldened to organize. Here in the Fraser Valley, the KKK started organizing and started leafleting again. So we organized a meeting at Spartacus Books, which is a anarchist bookstore, and I made a documentary a while ago called Hate Can Kill about the murder of caretaker at the Sikh Gurudwara who was murdered by the white supremacists, to get some discussion going that this is not just happening over there, but it's actually happening in our backyard, and these people can actually kill. And that spurred the interest of creating a coalition inspired by the work of the early BC organization to fight racism in the 70s that organized and pushed back the KKK. And so again, being non-binary queer Muslim, I wanted to have a broader intersectionality instead of just racism. So hence the Coalition Against Bigotry. We didn't want to have a colonial construct, so Pacific. And then we started organizing in 2017. Traditionally, we've had March 21st as a day against racism march here in Vancouver over the years. So we organized March 2017, a broad coalition working with different organizations, unions, and so on, to organize a big march that started in the near Chinatown, SkyTrain area. And then we marched through the downtown east side, and the soldiers of Odin followed us. And we were kind of prepared for this. So we came to an area, and then they kind of surrounded us, and the police just watched, didn't really do anything. And the soldiers of Odin started lifting up chairs, and one of them was making a beeline to me, and people started yelling at the police, why aren't you doing anything? They finally kind of took them aside and handcuffed them and then released them just as the rally was releasing out so they can come and then harass us again. So this is the early organizing we did. We did a bunch of leaflets showed up at different SkyTrain stations in East Vancouver and many other areas by the KKK. Again, the main organizers that were following us, and they did a bunch of other rallies and so on, was the Soldiers of Odin, which are not listed as a terrorist organization yet. And then a bunch of organizers started organizing, if you remember, and I think it was 2018, having these rallies at city halls. So they had this big rally at City Hall, and a bunch of leftist organizers decided to organize against them and didn't contact us. So it was all led by a bunch of white organizers, and this created a friction that's saying that, why are we being so divisive, and why are you using your privilege to organize without us? And the mayor refused to do anything to stop these white supremacists from organizing City Hall, basically invited people to come and stop them themselves. Of years of organizing in this city, the police have always stopped us from organizing and arrest us for breach of the peace. But no, they would not stop these people. They would let them organize. And there was a big, big rally at City Hall. We did not want to participate in because we didn't want to put our people, marginalized people, queer, trans, non-binary, folks of color, Indigenous, Black, we didn't want to put them at risk. But we were very critical of the fact that there's double standards done when it comes to not stopping the right, but stopping activists and so on. In terms of, and so basically the organizing got fractionalized, and people haven't been working together here in this coast, unfortunately. And when this convoy happened, there was sort of sporadic organizing that happened to stop them. And they were coming in from the valley in trucks, as you know, they came across the country. And they did manage to block some of the traffic going on into downtown. And so that's what's been going on. So, we've been watching what's going on. We've been critical of the fact that our governments, whether it's a city government or provincial and federal government, are not doing much to stop the right, to stop the hate. There's no clarity on any legislation against hate. And the police are not doing anything to stop these organizers. We've seen a lot of racism in the rise lately, and xenophobia against the Chinese community. Islamophobia is still there. The police say, give us more money so we can do nothing. And organizations like us or Black Lives Matter and other organizations who do good work working in Indigenous communities are getting no funding, no support. They're doing patrols, but again, there's no trust for the police. That's where we are here at this coast. Thank you.
Can I just, as a very quick follow-up, Imtiaz, how big did those far right, you mentioned people came in from the Valley into Vancouver for inspired by the Freedom Convoy, and so could you just give a sense of how big that
so
far right was?
And
was it the same people as before or different groups?
Yeah, so I think the Soldiers of Odin are the connecting factor. They're pretty much involved. They started organizing the convoys in Langley, which is in the Fraser Valley and so on, and then drove their way through Highway 1 down to downtown Vancouver. Incidentally, the Soldiers of Odin were also very involved with the anti-trans rallies that were held recently and so on. So, they're anti-trans, they're anti-queer, they're anti-Muslim, they're anti-immigrant, anti-Asian, anti-Indigenous. Pretty much what you've been saying across from the other people. Thank you.
Thank you. And so our next question, and it picks up on some of what MTS was talking about in the Vancouver context. And so, which is about the organizing, the anti-fascist, anti-far right organizing folks have been doing in their respective cities. And MTS made reference to being able to block, in this one particular instance, around the Freedom Convoy, being able to stop some of the far right from taking public space, or at least stop them from taking all of the public space that they might like to have taken. So to our roundtable guests, can you just talk a little bit about what kind of numbers in response have you been able to organize in response to the growing presence of the far right? Have you been successful, or to what extent have you been successful in reclaiming public space when the far right is mobilizing? And related to that, how, if at all, have you been able to balance perhaps the need for both a mass movement, like drawing in as wide layers of people as possible, both for safety and effectiveness, but also for, while at the same time being able to engage in perhaps some of the confrontation that might be necessary to try to reclaim public space against far right forces. So yeah, and so maybe this time we'll start from, if it's okay for them, start with Vancouver and move our way eastward. And I recognize that you had already gestured at some of this, MTS. So if there's anything else you'd like to add in terms of what kind of numbers you've had, have you been regularly successful when necessary at taking back public space when the far right mobilizes?
Yeah, as I said, that we have been fractionalized. So there's been very ad hoc organizing because people do not want to, they want to work on their own, or they want to work on under their own brand. So, which is unfortunately because divided we fall. So there was, recently we haven't done that. There was a mobilization, thousands of people did show up to stop the right organizing in City Hall back in 2018. That was the mass. Again, there was controversy about, why isn't the city stopping? And so on. So there was a disconnect there. But in terms of organizing against the convoy, it hasn't been organized, and people have been, it has been organized, but very sporadically. Again, not with us. Nobody's contacted us, but they were able to block some of the traffic going to downtown.
Thank you. Then moving eastward to Calgary, to what extent do you think, Rory, you've been successful anti-fascist organizers in taking back public space when necessary, and how have you managed taking back public space and building a mass movement that's secure and so on for folks?
Yeah, so there wasn't, as I kind of mentioned before, there was only kind of more sporadic counter-protest activity against these rallies in 2021. So kind of usually against specific events like the Tiki Torches or that anti-mandate activist was Chris Sky. But as I said, by early 2022, these rallies became almost like festivals. Like there was merchandise table selling, like T-shirts that, you know, like F Trudeau, and these T-shirts that said "Pure Blood," which had like kind of racist overtones, but also was referring to like being unvaccinated. You'd have the Maxime Bernier's People's Party of Canada would have set up a table with volunteers and branded stuff. The Wild Rose Independence Party, sort of Alberta separatist far right organization, would also set up. And as I said, white supremacists were seen attending like basically weekly. And with the marches along 17th Avenue, people basically started avoiding this neighborhood and not going to bars or anything. And you'd find white supremacist stickers that were left behind. And what was really upsetting to a lot of people was that the police were present at these marches, but they wouldn't enforce any kind of like apparent violations of laws or bylaws, like for like noise bylaws, parking, and in many cases they were just acting as parade escorts, even though that these marches had no permits whatsoever. So for us, it was turning kind of this sort of widespread discontent in the neighborhood and kind of inner city Calgary in general into like kind of more of a viable opposition force that could compel some kind of change. So basically, February, March, we kind of had more of an initial small counter protest, which increased its numbers until we were actually able to block and redirect that march on 17th Avenue. And it kind of also eventually forced the police to take some kind of action against these rallies. So there was kind of a small crisis on March 12th when counter protesters blocked the anti-mandate rally in March on 17th Avenue, and police made the decision to actually just try and forcibly clear the counter protesters off the street, saying no, that telling the counter protesters that they didn't have a permit to block the street, but this march that also did not have a permit had the right to go through. So they attacked a whole bunch of people with mountain bikes, or with the police mountain bikes. It actually turned to be a very ineffective decision by the police, but the news footage of it also generated a lot of blowback and circulated pretty widely on social media. That the public was sort of outraged that these sort of belligerent anti-mandate protests were just terrorizing the neighborhood, and residents stood up as counter-protest and then were assaulted by the police for their efforts. And this counter-protest was helped in large part because of the frustration of local businesses, which had seen their revenues drop very substantially during these protests, marches. So public support for counter-protesters ranged from pretty expected, like anti-fascist left, to small business coalitions, and the Calgary Chamber of Commerce came out to side with the counter-protest. So it was kind of very unusual and odd. And eventually this led the city to get a court injunction that was put in place the following weekend, which would have been March 19th, which ended the sort of permissive environment for anti-mandate protesters and restricted their activity to the Civic Plaza, which is in front of City Hall. So basically this injunction banned blocking roadways or going through or marching down streets. You could not use amplified sound equipment without a permit. And it basically compelled the police to arrest people who violated this. And then sort of on March 19th, the police did end up arresting about 6 people on, I guess, both sides, both protesters and counter-protesters. So basically the challenge for the counter-protest has been kind of a limited number of anti-fascist activists in Calgary and low levels of kind of community organizing during the pandemic. However, a lot of the people who came in for these anti-mandate protests were there to kind of just march and parade and weren't there to get confronted, and got a lot less enjoyment when faced with counter protests and like potential like even like harassment by the police. So the injunction sort of restricted where they could go and their ability to march. So like their crowds, the number of people they had like dropped substantially. So now, well, they still have weekly rallies, they really only like pull in like 300-400 people.
Only.
Can I
Yeah.
quickly just jump
Yep.
in? That it's interesting, Rory, that you talk about the injunctions, because that's what was called for in 2018 here with the city hall protests. Like even Don Davies from the NDP said that there should be an injunction, but the city says we can't do anything. So it's interesting to say that it has been used, and it has been used here against anti-logging protesters, but not against the right.
Thanks. That's a very good point. So Chelsea, in Ottawa, what kind of I mean, to some degree, I think there was a lot of a focus on Ottawa, well, not to some degree, but because of the Freedom Convoy, and following it from a distance, it appeared that maybe there was a bit of initial hesitancy for some folks on the left to collectively mobilize a response to try to directly take space back. Again, that's a witness from the distance. Perhaps that's not entirely fair, although there's some individual acts of bravery by people standing in front of trucks and so on. But then, of course, there was eventually a mobilization that included perhaps most prominently the so-called Battle of Billingsbridge, when a bunch of trucks were stopped and so on. But there's probably other things that are going on. So could you just give us a sense of how many people, both during and perhaps after the Freedom Convoy, have anti-fascist organizers been able to mobilize onto the streets, and to what extent do you think that they've been successful in taking back public space, and successful also in building a sort of a wider mass movement?
Yeah, for sure. I think that there's a couple things here to go back to. Is when I was talking to other people about what was going on with anti-fascist organizing in the lead up to the convoy, some folks talked to me about how there was sort of a group, Ottawa Against Fascism, and that it kind of fell apart. Particularly what I've heard is that there was issues around misogyny. And, I'm not going to say other things that I've heard there, but anyway. And so there's this group, and then it led to conflict to kind of dissolved. And so this kind of sets the stage where there wasn't really a sort of experienced anti-fascist militant group in town that was actively organizing. There was efforts, of course, like when United We Roll came into town, people organized a counter demo there, but not sort of an active ongoing group taking on more militant tactics. And likewise, I think it's really important to keep in mind that my sense from living here just a couple of years is, during the pandemic, I kind of think that the broad left, our muscles kind of atrophied, right? Is that, there's various groups organizing around racial justice. There was folks organizing rather, large and significant protests on those issues, but sort of broader tent organizing or coalition organizing, not as much, not as big, wide tent coalitions. And so kind of, when the first, the Freedom Trucker movement came to town, I think a lot of folks kind of thought it'd be like United We Roll, where yeah, you'll do your thing and then out you go. And then they didn't. And then they dug in and they stayed put. And I think with the vacuum of militant anti-fascists, I know that some folks were going around, they were egging trucks, they were doing some monkey wrenching type things, but by and large, it was kind of like a void for a bit. And so there's a couple attempts to have some counter demos. Some different folks popped up and tried to organize those, and then there was sort of feelings of like, can we put enough stuff in place to be ready for this kind of thing? We're not sure. So in that context, where I work at Public Service Alliance of Canada National Capital Region, we kind of got involved and started calling two streams of meetings. One was sort of a labor coalition meeting, and the other is a community organizing, like NGOs, orgs, groups like that. It's also really important to keep in mind that in the first initial weeks, a lot of organizing went into just mutual aid, direct support, people getting groceries for seniors because the grocery stores stopped delivering. I mean, downtown Centertown was mayhem. People wanted and requested walks they didn't feel safe walking around town. So let's not forget that that is organizing and that is critical support, just helping people get through and survive a very large far right occupation of your city. But the sort of the political opposition, the more confrontational stuff, we had these coalition meetings, and there was a steering committee, and then we kind of created this, this thing, Community Solidarity Ottawa, trying to be a big tent that didn't really exist until this moment. And then the steering committee, organized February 12th march in the Glebe, which is a neighborhood in Ottawa. It was relatively further away from where the convoy occupation was happening, just as a sort of a first step of, well, if we build it, will they come? And also, recruiting and building a marshal team of experienced marshals, people who were from labor, who maybe had experience from picket lines, that kind of thing. And building a lot of networks of trust, right? And this is the sort of thing, is that by the time a far right, convoy is occupying your city, it's really hard to bring in new people, but you can at least reach out to the groups that you haven't been organizing with or working with. And so there was people, and we were trying to rebuild the strengthening of our muscles of collaboration, and not knowing how to organize together, and not knowing, not having a lot of recent experience in the pandemic along those lines. So that led to, the first big march there. We had, I think, about 4,000 people out in the Glebe. Some folks that I've talked to since were like, we definitely, kind of overdid it on the safety protocols, but there was this sort of very tense feeling of, we don't know what these groups are going to do. We don't know what some lone wolf white supremacist with like a grudge is going to do. So it's, maybe we were a bit cautious, but it was also very understandable. If you're talking about a group of 30 to 40 people having a thing on a hill, that's one thing. If you're talking about a significant occupation with, what we were learning about some of these ex-military intelligence people involved, it got a little bit intimidating. And then the next day was the Battle of Billingsbridge, which I have a link to in case anyone, just put it in the chat. There's a write-up about it there. There's so much to say about that day, but it was this dog walking group that, kind of got in touch with itself and said, hey, they're coming through. We see their route. We want to block them. And they just thought they were going to block it for maybe a bit, maybe it's symbolic. But when people saw this, they started showing up. And so we put it out over the marshals chat, for example, saying, hey, there's this action. Would people, with marshalling experience like to go to that? So folks went down there, and it was kind of this very organic, very spontaneous, direct confrontation. So I think it was 30 vehicles that were blocked, that they were coming in to support the convoy. They had their Canadian flags and their jerry cans, and folks held them there all day. And there was folks canvassing up and down. Like, I remember at one point we went and talked to the vehicles about, who here has childcare obligations, who might need to leave first, because we were also looking for an exit strategy of like, look, we're not able to hold these people indefinitely. Our own numbers are going to fall. Night is coming. How do we achieve what we want to achieve? And so we had up, going up and down the line there was assemblies sort of asking folks, okay, well, they're here, what do we want? And that's where the demands came from. Well, we want them to remove their racist decals from their trucks. We want them to remove their jerry cans, and they want them to remove their flags. And so those were the kind of conditions for release. And there's a lot to say about that day, but there was really this much more emboldened sense of, we're frustrated. The cities, especially downtown, is really tired of this. We want folks to go. And I'd say that day, because people kind of came and went, there was a couple hundred people out. There was also a lot of people dropping off pizza, bringing in supplies to make that counter demo or the sort of Battle of Billingsbridge sustainable, with food and coffee. And really important things in a tense situation is that you want people to be fed, not get cranky with each other. And I think that kind of, that was a pretty big and bold move there. It was sort of a bit more spontaneous, but we started to have a sort of a network of folks who could come and support and respond to situations like that. Since then, that there's been both, there was a community meetup where instead of it being a march or a protest or a thing, it was just an event in the park. people could get posters to promote the next upcoming march, check in, how you doing, how are people feeling, because it was after the police kind of cracked down the exclusion zone. We were supposed to have another demonstration, but then the Emergencies Act was announced. We saw that there was going to be this exclusion zone set up that involved police checkpoints, and nobody really felt like asking people to cross through a checkpoint was like ideal in terms of, knowing and hearing also what other panelists here are saying is that like the left knows very well enough not to trust the police, and to limit exposure as much as we can. And since then, so Community Solidarity Ottawa was built. It involved labor, community groups, this kind of thing, and it was it's continuing to organize. It organized in response to Rolling Thunder, which just kind of came and left through town. It held sort of a community meetup space, and then there was also the May Day block party after May Day, and so it seems to be, I kind of had to step back from that myself, because after the Convoy, one of our locals at work was on strike, and then more things and more things. But it seems like the missing coalition, the missing network is kind of, it's sort of starting to happen, and that's good. It's moving along as it should. And yeah, I think that, that there was interesting lessons along the way of getting labor involved. Sort of one of the things that was shared with me is that in earlier iterations against the fascists in the city is that labor wasn't as organized or as involved. It was more like labor activists and staff, but this time around there's a broader tent built that way, and I think it really helped to have a union, PSAC National Capital Region, Alex Silas as the regional executive vice president, willing to step out and say we got to do something, we got to address this, we got to get people on the same page, we got to build this coalition, build this tent together. So I think I'm going to leave it at that for now.
Thanks. Nicholas, can you talk a little bit about Montreal?
Yeah, I would just say maybe, I don't know, I hope it doesn't get annoying that I keep kind of jumping between rest of Canada and Quebec, but it's something that strikes me because I'm working with the Council of Canadians now, and so I'm in touch with members who are in smaller towns and mid-sized towns across Canada, and it's I think what's happening in the rest of Canada, but less so in Quebec, is that there is kind of like this shock of recognition that there is a fascist threat that is brewing in the bowels of Canadian society, and I think it is a golden, organizing opportunity for the anti-fascist left. And I think, people have to go out and seize it and build these kinds of coalitions that Chelsea was talking about, build these kind of broader groupings that bring people together and give them the capacity to mobilize and to recognize the threat. Because, we had a lot of people who are not like, who are politically informed but who are not by any stretch of the means and stretch of the imagination part of the revolutionary left saying, like, oh my God, like what the fuck is going on in Ottawa? Like what is happening with the police? I never thought that this could possibly happen here, in Quebec, like that kind of shock of the threat of the far right, and the fascist right, I think it came more around, with the growth of La Meute, but especially with the massacre in Quebec City in January 2017. That was really when I think anyone who had any doubts about like all this stuff about headscarves and religious symbols was just a kind of electoralist diversion. Those illusions were kind of shattered and dismissed because it became clear that this was killing people, and this is where it would lead. And so I think that was in Quebec, that was really the moment when we started trying to organize more broadly, where coalitions, anti-racist coalitions, started trying to bring in student unions and labor unions. We had a few fairly large protests against racism back in 2017, 2018 in Montreal. and in other places, there were counter mobilizations against the far right. Sometimes they were successful, other times they were less so. There was one in Montreal that was pretty successful where the anti-fascist groups were able to basically outnumber La Meute and their allies who were trying to demonstrate in Montreal, and they ended up trapped in a garage, in a basement garage, protected by the police for a couple of hours, sweating it out, basically. So there have been small victories like that, but you know, it's unfortunate that the anti-fascist left is not as mobilized or as organized as it was a couple of years ago either. So, you know, the far right is disorganized, but it's not because we're stronger or better organized, unfortunately. I think, you know, I think we need those kind of intermediate organizations that allow ordinary people to link up. You know, in Montreal, we have a very strong kind of anarchist-led anti-fascist groups. They do a tremendous amount of, you know, invaluable research, just tracking the far right, tracking who they are and what they're up to, doxing them in some cases and stuff like that. But that's like really small scale stuff, and there needs to be kind of structures built that scale that up. You know, and so yeah, I think that's kind of where we're at. Like there's been headway made in the media too. Someone was asking about the kind of the general context of this stuff that produces fascism. I mean, in Quebec, I think if Quebec has a stronger far right than the rest of Canada, and it's an open question, I'm not even sure how you measure that, but if it does, it owes a lot to the kind of, you know, what I would call the identitaire right, basically this anti-Muslim, anti-immigrant, right-wing political current that is just so strong in the media. You know, you have Québécois media empire, which is owned by this billionaire, Pierre-Carl Pelado. And it was basically a conscious choice that he pushed his papers and his radio stations in that direction. It's the most widely read newspapers, Journal de Montréal, Journal de Québec in the province. And they're just churning out this kind of low-level hate against Muslims and against all immigrants day after day after day. And so it's really important to fight against that. And there have been some successes and some breaches where anti-racist and anti-fascist, anti-racist at least voices are getting more of a hearing since I would say like 2018, with people like Émilie Nicolas, who I think appears on English media sometimes as well as a commentator. She has a regular column, you know, Will Prosper, a few other people, you know, who have kind of started to be able to have their voices heard in the media space and contest this kind of identitaire narrative of what's happening in Quebec.
Just a really quick follow-up question for a few of you. Chelsea mentioned the presence of labor with respect to the in Ottawa with respect to the Freedom Convoy. So if you could just very quickly address this, starting with Nick. Like, was there a president? Like, has labor? To what extent has the labor movement been active within the anti-fascist organizing, whether individuals or like in a more organized sense, I suppose, than just a few individuals? Would you say it's been active at all, or is that a big gap in the organizing? Nick, start with you.
Since the convoy, I don't know if labor has done anything in Quebec. Certainly, like one of the big changes that happened, and I think that was the work of people working through the unions and through Quebec Solidaire, where I was very involved in work around kind of pushing the party to take a clearly anti-racist position in these debates around religious symbols. And we won that debate, and you know, I think people were doing similar work in the unions. So when the Bill 21, which banned headscarves for judges, prosecutors, and school teachers in Quebec, when it came into effect, you had all of the major union federations who had taken positions against it. And whereas when you had the Charte de Valeur debate back in 2013, 2014, with the Parti Québécois in power, almost all of the unions were on board or silent on it. So there's definitely some headway that's been made, at least as far as like anti-racist politics. But in Quebec, I don't think there's been much mobilization against the far right, again, for this reason that you know, it's not as new or as shocking, maybe. I would say that at the council level, our chairperson, John Cartwright, has put a lot of energy into building up the what's called the Community Solidarity Project, which is basically trying to kind of provide support and capacity building to other communities who want to build organizations like Community Solidarity Ottawa, and build up this kind of mobilization against the far right. And there are a lot of unions and some church groups and other groups around the table that are providing funding and supporting that work. So I think that's a very positive thing, and I hope it continues, because it's really needed.
Oh, sorry. Rory, just quickly, what kind of union presence, formal union presence, has there been, if any, in Calgary?
Not like super strong presence. The counter protest did reach out to labor groups, and they were friendly, and I believe did do some sending information out to their members and encouraging them to attend, because essentially what happened was, over a series of about 5 weeks, is that the numbers of counter protesters grew as it got media attention, but a lot of the people that it was drawing was people who essentially like lived in the neighborhood. So it went from about 40 people to about 200 in a couple of weeks, and it was actually sort of like community associations that are like the sort of official community associations for each like neighborhood. So one of the ones downtown in the Beltline actually put out a call to its mailing list to tell people to show up, yeah, that was kind of the main thing. And also reaching out to like other groups like Black Lives Matter and sort of existing anti-fascist organizers and groups in Calgary, rather than like labor per se didn't really show up in huge numbers, but there were definitely people who were like known labor activists in the city who did come and told people to come, but it wasn't really like heavily organized by the labor movement itself.
Thank you. Just quickly, Imtiaz, could you comment on the presence or non-presence of?
Yes. So when we started organizing in 2017, we had a large coalition that included labor, and it was Indigenous POC led. And then when things broke down, we were critical of, the racism within the organizing. And so when the white supremacists started organizing in city halls, they decided to organize without us. Was not labor per se, but some of the people who were involved in those organizings, the sort of took up the organizing and so on. So the labor wasn't as involved. And I think the big issue for us was the pandemic. Since the pandemic, there has been not as much organizing, and also the labor has not been involved this time around. When the Convoy came out, it was more sporadic. Also of note, labor used to organize May Day rallies pre-pandemic. This time around, there was not much. So I think pandemic may be a big factor, but the labor is not as involved as it used to be.
Thank you. And I'll just very quickly, for folks, I'll note, because I'm based in Toronto, far right organizing kind of definitely linked to anti-mandate organizing, basically started fairly early as the pandemic lockdown started, and over the last year or so grew a fair bit. Before the Freedom Convoy, there was at times there was in the low thousands, I want to say, in Toronto, and then during the height of the Freedom Convoy in Ottawa, the solidarity protests in Toronto there was one that had at least a few thousand, probably more than that, and a lot of People's Party flags as well, among other flags present. If there's someone out there that disagrees with me, by all means they can throw it into the chat to indicate so. But my sense is that having been involved in the past in anti-fascist organizing in Toronto, it's not in the greatest shape either here as well, and certainly had no capacity to muster a response to the size of the solidarity rallies in late February with the Freedom Convoy. So I'm going to ask one more question. I have a few more questions that we worked on as the organizers of this event, but there's also a few questions in the chat or in the question and answer that we can get to, and we can come back to some of our other questions as well if we have time, which I think we might. But just before we do that, there's a long history of anti-fascist organizing, of course, going all the way back to the 1930s, but you can even go back before that to responses to proto-fascist groups in various parts of the world. But even in the last few decades, like going back to the early 1970s, there's been different ways of anti-fascist organizing from Canada, the United States, to Britain, to France, to other parts of the world as well, Latin America and so on. So I'm just wondering, again, I'll just ask you to be mindful of time, our roundtable guests, if you just very quickly, is there any particular movement or organizing historically that that inspires you at all in the present, and why is that? So maybe we'll go west to east again, if that's okay. So Intias, you want to just quickly?
Yeah, again, the inspiration was the good work that was done by the BC Organization to Fight Racism, which had a lot of union involvement in the day, led by POC activists. And that organizing was when the KKK was at its height, and was basically organizing against the KKK in the Valley. And the organizing was very effective, very organized, and it was able to push the organizing of the KKK underground. And that was the inspiration of the work we had done. When the neo-Nazis were organizing again in the 90s, we kind of regrouped some of those people, and we had the Anti-Nazi League in the 90s that was organizing against them. And then again, the Trump phenomenon in 2016 that kind of brought us back together too, because they were organizing again.
Thank you. Rory, is there any particular historical movement that inspires you and how you think about the work that you're doing?
Not like a specific historical example, because I guess in the context of Calgary, like historically, anti-fascist organizing has mostly been around outnumbering fascist rallies in public and making it just sort of difficult and hostile for them to show up. And that's sort of how, particularly the last 20 years in the city, that this has been done. But obviously, much like everyone else has described, that sort of atrophying of like organizing capacity during the pandemic has also happened in Calgary, and just also the sheer numbers of these anti-mandate rallies made that sort of a difficult tactic, because you could always expect to be like heavily outnumbered by the far right. So basically what we were looking at was how to challenge them so they don't feel entitled to just sort of openly organize in public. So actually kind of what inspired Community Solidarity Calgary was more recent events. So like the Battle of Billingsbridge, or in Vancouver, where all those cyclists blocked the convoy, were kind of the immediate inspirations for what to do, like just basically preventing them from going wherever they want it, even though you'd be heavily outnumbered in some cases. Like ultimately the rally or the march would be able to get around the blockage somehow. And it was in some senses about like forcing a crisis in the city to basically get the city to like actually do something, because it wasn't like these rallies were popular. They were deeply unpopular with most residents. But yeah, that was sort of the main thing. It's just like looking at how people had dealt with like these convoys and these rallies in particularly in Ottawa and Vancouver, and how that could be applied in Calgary.
Thanks. Chelsea, just quickly, is there an historical example that sort of inspires you in how you think about organizing against fascists?
I mean, I think broadly there used to be a labor movement that was far more militant on this front in directly confronting fascist tendencies. That's not really where we're at today. One of the folks I talked to, who has much more local history about fighting fascists in Ottawa, reminded me of the earlier fights in the 90s against the very active Heritage Front, about sort of clashes back then, about counter-organizing then, and it seems to think that labor was involved in that timeline. But it was much more, sort of smaller nucleus group of folks going out to counter. I mean, not tiny, but not like a mass 4,000 people showing up to confront fascism. So I definitely could draw inspiration from that and some of those histories there for sure.
Thank you. And in Toronto, historically, there's a much greater labor movement presence as well in anti-fascist organizing, particularly going back to the 1930s. But yeah, Nicholas, is there an historical example that inspires you if you want to just very briefly mention?
Yeah, I mean, in general, thinking about this stuff in Quebec, it's been so tied to anti-Muslim politics that definitely just on an intellectual level, connecting with the writings of Sivananda and people from the Institute of Race Relations in the UK, Aaron Kundani and others, just really being blown away by the kind of links that they make between the far right and racism and imperialism. And I think that's something that is pretty important. In Quebec, it's no accident that the people leading La Meute and a lot of these other groups have passed through the military. It's a safe space for white supremacists and white nationalists. So of course they go there and they get the training and they get the chops. So I think that's been fundamental. I've also, since the Convoy, I've been reading. I read Clara Zetkin on fascism, the resolutions that she wrote in 2019, 23, 24. I don't know if that's the best place to go looking for advice from the German left. It didn't work out very well for them when they tried it. But what was interesting was just to read these early analyses, because I had a number of friends who were on the left and been very involved in politics and got sucked into the Convoy stuff, or at least became kind of sympathizers to it, if not actively involved in it. And I found that really troubling. And so I kind of, and they were saying, well, no, it's not fascist, right? It's not fascist. There was one or two flags, but most of the people here are just good, ordinary working class people, blah, blah, blah. And, you reread Zetkin and it's clear that it's like, she wasn't saying either that these were all kind of foaming at the mouth racists or anti-Semites, right? Like, when fascism acquires a mass base, that's not necessarily what it's going to look like. And I think that's the moment that we're confronted with now, is that we are moving from, the far right being this groups of 30, 40, maybe 100 people who they can pull out for a small rally, to being something that actually does have a mass base. And I think it demands a different analysis and different tactics from the left than what's been done before in previous instances.
Thank you. And I don't have the time right now to type it in there, but people can Google the Zetkin. Haymarket published a book of her writings and speeches in fascism from, they posted a few years ago, Clara Zetkin. So thank you very much. So I'll just quickly turn to the chat here, and I'll probably, we'll have a bunch of questions, and I have some more questions for you folks as well. I'll just note, looking at the chat, and I'll just remind people, because some people looked like they might have been typing their questions in. So I said the chat, I meant put the questions in the question and answer. If you could do that, that would be great. It's a bit hard for me to both look at the question and answer, ask our speakers, and then sort of scroll through what's going on in the chat. I can't really keep track of that. I'll just note there's a comment here by Brian Latour. Oh, I apologize, Brian, but my apologies. I think one important thing is the role of people doing online research and open source intel work. It's soul crushing work, but I think that made a big difference in terms of the organizing against Rolling Thunder. It really helped both shape the media coverage and help organizers on the ground know what's happening. I think this research, which influences our communication strategies around Rolling Thunder in Ottawa, did make a difference, both in terms of just the air war in the media, quote, or parentheses, fascists are really bad at media, by the way, as well as the impact it made on the ground. I do think public pressure from CSO, I apologize, I think Community Solidarity Ottawa, CSO, and Horizon Ottawa did force the Ottawa Provincial Police Service, Ottawa Police Service response. So just again, very, very quickly, there's a number of questions. So we'll start with just totally arbitrary. Chelsea, was there any particular attention that you that organizes in Ottawa. Well, Brian obviously sort of is indicating that. And there's anything else you want to add in terms of like the online research prep that you did around the work that you did in Ottawa?
Yeah, for sure. And I think that monitoring, I so agree that it's soul crushing, right? Is that you're kind of finding their channels and listening in, and there was entire groups of folks who were monitoring convoy communications, monitoring threats. Even during the Battle of Billingsbridge, there was folks monitoring, what's Pat King saying? He's trying to send people over to harass us. So we got early heads up about, their tactics, what they're doing, them being on the move. Some of us involved in the safety group were monitoring a lot of these around the timeline Convoy 1.0. And it's actually it's really interesting is like it can be soul crushing, but it can also be very deeply revealing. There was this one thing that was shared on one of the Instagrams that I was monitoring, and it was this thing that it was like a convoy supporter saying like, my family has blocked me on Facebook and my friends have blocked me on Facebook, and yet I found all new friends and family in this convoy. And I think that this is really instructive, right? As the left, is that I understand for various protective reasons. Sometimes we don't want to engage, or our mental health is important to protect. But I thought it was very instructive to see this thing shared that like a convoy supporters' experience was that everybody else had been rejecting them, and then they found open, welcoming arms of the right. And if you think about what it's like to organize among the left versus organize among the right, where the left is prone to perfectionism and critiquing critiques and critiques of the critiques of the critiques. And I think that sometimes is like, we can speak to atrophy during the pandemic, but we can also speak to perfectionism of leftist initiatives. And anyway, I've gone way far away from the point of what the monitoring was all about, but yeah, critical, keep an eye on it, keep an ear to the ground. What are they doing? What are they planning? And who's a reliable source of information? Sometimes you'd see some online claims and they wouldn't come true and other things would. Soul crushing, people were feeding that information into established networks, and it was absolutely critical for sure.
Thank you. Just again, like I'll ask the roundtable guys if you want to add anything. Is there anything you just quickly want to add to that, Nicholas, or internet monitoring?
No, I mean, I think it's one of the strengths of the anti-fascist left in Montreal and in Quebec is there, in addition to Montreal anti-fascist, there's also Xavier Camus, who's like a cégep prof who just is constantly cranking out these analyses and stuff. So there's like a lot of good material there that has been built up. I think the issue now is to kind of to build a base and a wider base, and to share this material with people and help them understand the threat that these groups pose. Because if they do manage to solidify a base, it's not just the convoy and the restrictions and stuff that they'll be putting pressure on the government on. It's, I've read a number of times where convoy supporters were saying, well, we're worried about the climate mandates too. They're going to bring climate mandates next. And this is something that even people in the Conservative Party, Cheryl Gallant, who's the MP for, I think, Ottawa Valley, has put out to her supporters. So, I mean, it's clear, like if we actually want to, stop frying the planet and have real climate action in Canada, these are going to be some of the first groups that are going to be mobilizing against us. So, yeah.
Thank you. Just again, quickly, Imtiaz, was there any like importance to, or anything you want to add, or on the internet?
Yeah, no, I mean, the people in the coalition have been monitoring them. I haven't been because, obviously I can't go incognito. In fact, they're monitoring me and the coalition, the work we're doing. So they're monitoring us clearly, and I've been targeted. I was captured by right-wing media on YouTube at one of the rallies, and branded me as a communist terrorist sympathizer that went wide on YouTube. So yeah, definitely be aware that they're watching, and they may be watching now. Thank you.
Rory?
Yeah, I'd just like to comment on Brian Latour's point about sort of the air war and media. And that was sort of very interesting part of what happened in Calgary was that these rallies, the anti-mandate rallies, actually did not get a great deal of media coverage until like February, March, largely because the ralliers were like quite hostile to journalists and would harass them and chase them away. It's not that Calgary's media is left wing, really. I mean, it's quite like generally quite conservative, but essentially because these ralliers generally would not talk to journalists, and the rallies also kind of alienated a lot of the business community downtown, it meant that it was quite easy for Community Solidarity Calgary to put their message out and speak to the mainstream media. So between kind of from March 12th and the week afterwards, Community Solidarity Calgary got about 50 media hits in like the local newspapers and TV channels and that sort of thing, which was very, very good for getting our message out about how this is about residents standing up for themselves against an aggressive, intimidating group that also, like, by March 1st, most of the restrictions in Alberta, or virtually all of them, had gone down. And a lot of people were wondering, what are these protests and rallies even about? So it was kind of very nice to have like that ability to talk to the media and put your message out while the rallies didn't even talk to journalists. So that really helped shape public perception of what was happening in the Beltline.
Thank you. I'll just note there's been a couple comments or a question about the kind of social political context in which the rise of the far right is taking place currently, and I'll just point the questioner and everyone in attendance to our previous the first panel on the far right, which took that question up in more detail, and it also has links in that discussion to a number of articles that were written, including by the people who spoke on that panel. So that information is out there, and I'll just encourage people to have a look at that if they haven't seen it already. And another a person just asks about is there a comprehensive resource? And rather than ask the roundtable, I'll just suggest if there's anyone that has a comprehensive resource that could be shared to people who don't believe that Canada has a far right problem. And I don't have a specific resource off the top of my head, but what I can suggest that people do is look at this, look at our both after the Convoy sessions, the first one and this one in particular, because there's been a lot of discussion on the realities of the far right in particular cities and people who are confronting them. So that's at least one resource that people can look at, and so that's something for people to have a look at. I'll encourage them to have a look at that. But if anyone else has a more comprehensive resource that they can have a look at or recommend, by all means, I would that would be great if they could do so. So one question is several questions. So I'm going to do my best to try and get to some of them. And so one question is, how did the lack of a critical left response to the pandemic, where the left basically became a left flank for state and public health policies to open up space for the conscious intervention by the far right to merge with and take over anti-vaxxer, anti-masker movement. This organizing allowed white supremacist fascist forces to develop a mass base. And I don't know if that might be more of a comment than a question, but if anyone amongst our roundtable guests has any thoughts on what role the lack of a left critical response to the pandemic played in creating space for the far right, if anyone would like to jump in, then please, by all means. Chelsea, go ahead.
Yeah, totally. I learned interesting things down at both the marches that we had, as well as when we were talking directly with people at Battle of Billingsbridge. There, when we were car talking and chatting with folks, sometimes I would try out different things and bring up, we have concerns about how the pandemic was handled too, and they would be surprised. Like, we don't just love Trudeau, but they hadn't heard of this. And I said, well, don't you think by now everyone should have paid sick days? Like, don't you think this many years into a pandemic that should have been one? And actually that would be good. And it's like, so what, or we're talking about, a critique of big pharma is that the current plan is for everybody to get boosters because we're not sharing the vaccine globally because Canada hasn't signed on to the TRIPS waiver. And so the current plan is for, for Canada to just keep spending and spending, and everyone has to get boosters. And so if we shared the vaccine and had a real effort there, maybe we wouldn't have so many variants. And they were like, oh yeah, just sort of left critiques. But that's the thing, is that when we talk about the atrophied muscles of the left, like the broad coalition left, I think that that's really important, because I think that, I hope I don't sound like I'm putting folks down. I think that in the pandemic, a lot of us, we weren't necessarily doing our job. I'm going to speak as myself, as I work in labor. I think, we should have had a sustained mass movement for paid sick days. I think we should have had thousands of people in the streets when CERB ended. I think that we should have, we should be fighting today. 2 more benefit programs end May 7th today. That's the caregiver recovery benefit and the sort of wonky federal paid sick days program that exists, but it sort of doesn't. And I think that by not fighting for these very material supports for people, right? So average working class folks, they get sick, they don't have paid sick days, they don't have CERB anymore. Where are they going to go? And if we're not out in the streets articulating a sort of left critique of the government's handling the pandemic, we're kind of yielding the terrain to the right to fill that with conspiracies, to fill that with, anti-vax stuff, and against mandates, about freedom, these kinds of things. And so I think that by not responding to very real material conditions of a lot of folks, that we kind of didn't do our jobs. We yielded the terrain. And then, of course, we've seen the rise of the right be able to scoop people up in those anxieties and point them to false solutions, racism, xenophobia, eugenics, this kind of thing, right? But I think that by and large, we didn't do our jobs, and we have some learning to do. I still think like that program is ending today. We should still be fighting for paid sick days. We should still be fighting for these things. It's a shame that we're not. I'm not sure why. I think maybe some of us, our jobs, our workplaces haven't been shut down. And so we haven't had to deal with knowing, well, wait, is CERB still a thing? Does that still exist? These kinds of benchmarks of what average working class folks are dealing with. Because I know that there's sort of this thing that, the far right was leading it, and there was business owners, and sure, but there was plenty of working class support for the convoy, in part because they were a public, very visible avenue for people to talk about their concerns around the pandemic. And in absence of us doing our work, that's kind of where we're at now.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to just quickly add to that before I move on to the next question, if that's okay? MTS, because there's several questions I want to try to get to. So
yeah, no, I agree. Just to add to Chelsea, I think there was a lack of unity or clarity, but there was also lack of clarity messaging from authorities around mandates or otherwise, and things like that caused the confusion. And I'm in public health, so I was talking to somebody the other day. They're talking about, oh, well, there's mandates, and there is no vaccine mandates. So there's all this confusion which these organizers feed on, right, to create more distrust and things like that. So definitely, I think there has been from the left organized response, but the messaging from authorities have been not very clear. They haven't been listening to scientists, and they've been all over the place. And there's been, largely a lot of anxiety coming out of the pandemic, which has fractured people. And I think the right have seized on that.
Thank you.
Sorry, can I jump? Just one. I do want to acknowledge, though, like I don't want to pretend that people just didn't organize anything during that time. I know that Justice for Workers was pushing really hard. They were having a lot of town halls. They were having, a lot of efforts that way. It would be a mistake to pretend that everyone just sat on their hands and took it easy. I think we were all navigating really difficult circumstances. There was a lot of webinars, but also looking at like the left ecology of social media, where we block and defriend and make our circles smaller is it's like, what was our online reach? And in absence of a street-based movement, that's kind of what I'm talking about more, is we didn't have a visible public street presence. Were we afraid of challenging, the health restrictions about groups and gatherings? Were we afraid that by stepping out and violating those, that we were, delegitimizing the importance of public health orders? I'm not sure. I'm not sure why we were timid. I think that there's a lot of reasons to think about there, but I think that it was not to our benefit.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a fair point. Yeah, because there were people doing organizing, but there's a lot of challenges in the pandemic, as people alluded to. Just a specific question for Nicholas. There's two, so I'll just, if Nicholas, you don't mind doing your best to sort of respond to them somewhat efficiently. If you feel like it, wondering if you could expand on the role of student unions specifically. I know they're much more politically engaged in Quebec than elsewhere, but I find it hard to conceive what would even look like for student unions to get involved in anti-fascist work. And then there's a second question, which is, how has Quebec nationalism changed over the last few years? Any absorption on identity? I don't quite know what that specifically means. Absorption on identity, such as hijab, turban, or still demarcated. So that might be, anyways, if you could. And again, just cognizant of the time so we can get through as many questions as possible.
Yeah, on the student union issue, yeah, student unions are a little different in Quebec. They have a different history than in the rest of Canada. We do have, this 2012 strike was organized by a coalition of more radical student groups that had a strong anarchist and socialist kind of presence in their leadership. And so that has kind of continued. And I mean, the student movement isn't in great shape right now, but in 2018, they were a little more mobilized. And so, yeah, they were supporting the kind of anti-racist mobilizations at that time, which was great. As for the kind of question of Quebec nationalism, I mean, that's been the whole kind of identitaire right project, is to reshape and remold Quebec nationalism to be this kind of thing that identifies with the West or Western civilization and says that our values are being threatened by immigrants, and especially Muslims, who are coming in and who are backwards and don't understand and are, hate women's rights and are hostile to gays and so on and so forth. And so that's kind of the new nationalism that they're trying to create, but it's in response to what existed before, which was actually much more open to the world, much more oriented to kind of linking Quebec's struggle for national independence with anti-colonial struggles abroad. There's been a big scandal recently in Quebec around, can you say the title of Pierre Vallière's famous book, Les Nègres Blancs d'Amérique, can you say the N-word? But no one actually reads the goddamn book, right? Like, if you read what Vallière was writing, he was drawing on the Black Panthers and the Black freedom movement in the US and making parallels there, which today would seem scandalous, but at the time actually was fairly well accepted even by anti-colonial thinkers. And was straight up saying that, like, we need to smash racism in order to have working class solidarity. So I think there's all sorts of rich resources in Quebec history, in the kind of this anti-colonial strand of Quebec nationalism that people like on the identitaire right, they just want to make us forget it and stamp it out. And so, yeah, we're fighting to reclaim some of that.
Thank you. So a couple questions that I think I'll try to put them together, and if anyone would like to respond, please by all means respond. What written or legal action or instrument is being developed to stop governments at all levels from protecting supposedly with the charter, the hate speech and hate acts of these weekly protests? So what written or legal action or instrument is being developed to stop governments from protecting the activities of the far right? I don't know if anyone has a sort of a sense of how to respond. But then another sort of connected question is, what are your feelings about the online hate legislation currently being debated in Parliament, which I suppose perhaps is one potential answer to that first question. If there's online hate legislation that's being debated in Parliament, but this question poses the question, is there any concern that with a political shift, the anti-fascist movement could be targeted if the legislation is overly broad? So there is a history of debate on the anti-fascist organizing as to what extent do you draw on the resources and the powers of the state to do some of our work for us. And certainly that came up around the Freedom Convoy, people supporting the mobilization of the police and so on, rather than community-led organizing. Slightly different discussion. But there's that history, the question of like where do you deploy free speech arguments when historically the left has been a major target of that. And as all of you, Imtiaz, at length discussed this, and others have discussed this, like when the police get mobilized, it's usually against our side, not against their side. So if any of you have any thoughts on any legislation that is being developed, or what you think of that as a strategy. And again, so I keep reiterating this, but there's several other questions that we'd love to get to as well. So if any of you have any thoughts on that, Rory.
Yeah, so fairly quickly, in terms of like the legal stuff, like within the context of Calgary, the issue was that there was existing like bylaws and other laws that could have been used to deal with some of the problems around these freedom rallies, like the fact that they were doing weekly marches and the police weren't doing anything about it. I mean, it's not surprising that the police were not really doing anything about this. Like in some senses, our strategy was just like saying these things, like they shouldn't just be able to march, because of course, like if we tried to do that, it would be like within a week or so, the police would be certainly happy to start arresting and finding people. So it was kind of like trying to force into like public debate this point about this is like incredible double standards, that these rallies can just harass communities for months on end. And even though there were existing legal mechanisms to deal with it, the police were simply not doing anything. And we were never arguing for that the police should go in and begin like cracking skulls, but rather that they weren't even using tools such as like enforcing like parking or noise violations, etc., to like try and do something about it. In terms of the federal legislation around hate speech, I don't know enough about it to like really offer a comment, but I do think that is a concern about how it would be applied to the left, because in the context of Calgary's injunction that came after March 12th, it did apply equally to everybody, which included us. Although, interestingly, the police did focus most of the resources on the Freedom Rally rather than Community Solidarity Calgary. But the injunction still meant that like Community Solidarity Calgary could not use amplified stuff or block any roads, etc. So at best, we can hope for that legislation is at least somewhat equally applied to both sides rather than entirely against us. But I don't know enough about the specifics of the federal law to comment much more.
Yes.
Yeah, so certainly we've been critical of anti-hate legislation. I mean, challenging attorney generals of all the governments to review and to look at what's not working, what's working, and even looking at how existing legislation is not applied as well. And there has been not much response. There is not currently debating this online hate stuff, but it doesn't stop from actual organizing, rallies at city halls and so on. Way back when Elizabeth May fought against Bill C-51, the Anti-Terror Act, it was, the Anti-Terror Act came into being, but was largely used against Muslims, right? And then they went on the anti-terror list and so on. If you look at Alexander Bissonnette, who murdered 6 people praying at the Quebec Mosque, he was not charged with any act of hate or any act of terrorism, okay? But recently, Nathan, I forget his last name, who killed those people in London, was charged with terrorism. So there is no clarity or uniformity on what laws there are, right? So we can look at what, in terms of this Emergencies Act, that there was criticism on the Emergencies Act. The fact of why wasn't the Anti-Terror Act or existing laws used, right? There's a lot of questions about that. So and the lack of clarity and the lack of the fact that like the police don't use existing laws have the question of whether or not our anti-hate legislation is effective, or do we need to strengthen it? And there's no that's what we've been struggling with, right? And the fact that the soldiers have not attacked us, the police have done nothing about it, and they continue to organize, and you know, that's the problem. Thank you.
I don't know if Chelsea or Nicholas have anything really brief to add. There's a couple other questions I think, or a few other questions that we can definitely try to get to, but I don't know if there's.
Well, just briefly, I mean, yeah, anything, I'm weary of anything that can be applied to the left, especially who is enforcing it. As we saw over the weekend for Rolling Thunder, somebody graffitied this, okay, this is gonna sound bananas to anyone outside of here, but there's a biker church. And so the bikers, they were going to service there. It was also happening near the Convoy. And somebody graffitied on there, "No haven for fascism" and "fuck off fascists." And the police are investigating this as hate-motivated mischief. And that led to a series of news articles that, you know, people who supported this Rolling Thunder were saying the only hateful incident was this graffiti. We're not hateful, they are. And this very sort of wishy-washy interpretation of what is hate to begin with, and the fact that the police announced it and named it as such, you know, I mean, like, they're not reliable to begin with. So, you know, I see a lot of these things as very dangerous types of so-called protections that could be very easily and disproportionately used against the left rather than the right. And, you know, likewise, when we saw the Emergencies Act, where that was, you know, it had these parameters, sure, but when we were trying to figure out, do we continue with our march, do we cancel? There's going to be a police barricade happening. Is it going to be like a police riot like the G20 in Toronto? We have no idea what's going to happen. You know, and this could very well be applied to the left and what we were trying to do, and very much disproportionately as well. So yeah, very much lots of hesitation there on those instruments for sure.
Thank you. There's a question. What are your groups, anti-fascist groups, doing in reaching out to larger numbers of community groups to get more numbers from religious groups to join protests? So would anyone like to, as anyone part of an organizing that's actively sought to reach out to religious groups? And if so, what does that look like? Please, MTS.
Yeah, I mean, we've been working with the Muslim community here, also Indigenous and Asian communities, trans communities that have been largely affected by hate and so on. Also with when we were starting the Coalition Against White Supremacy and Islamophobia, was organizing in Toronto. So we've been, you know, keeping tabs with them. So, and they're again connected with the Muslim communities and other communities that are affected. So yeah, that's what we've been doing in organizing, and you know, we have worked with labor and hopefully Chelsea, maybe we can work together with PSEC, because I know PSEC does amazing work that we do need to reconnect, and I'm really glad that we're connecting and networking today, that we need to continue this work.
Anyone else want to just quickly comment on your efforts to reach out to religious groups, if that's been a focus? Okay, Chelsea?
Just small anecdote, and I know it's not particularly reaching out to a religious group, but one thing that was really important, I think, in the Ottawa context is that the January 29th vigil to commemorate and mourn and remember the Quebec City Mosque massacre was canceled because the Convoy was in town. And so, and you know, it's really important to remember that some of the Convoy organizers are directly involved in spreading conspiracies about that incident. And so, you know, it was a bit of too little too late, I think. You know, there's some ideas at the last minute of maybe we could buffer and protect this vigil, maybe not. And so organizers moved ahead to move it online, cancel in person. So when we were organizing rallies later, we did reach out to the organizers of that event and brought them in as speakers to speak at one of the follow-up rallies, just because we wanted to take that space back and recognize that like this was supposed to happen. It was canceled because the very same people who are turning that incident into a conspiracy were in town, and we didn't get involved and help protect and in solidarity, try to make that happen anyway. So that was a small but I think significant sort of community collaboration there. Was it enough? Nope. But hindsight's 2020.
I think you had your hand up, Nick.
No, I
and
just
then-
want to add just quickly
Oh.
is that, a lot of the people that were affected in Ottawa, the shopkeepers and so on, were racialized people and so on. And I think that's really important to reach out to those people in terms of how organized, not maybe organized religious communities, but people who have been affected largely by this organizing. It'd be good to connect with them and help, organize with their support and involvement.
Thank you. Nicholas, and then I'm going to try and get 2 more questions in. So.
Sure. Yeah, I'll be quick. Just because we mentioned Bissonnette a few times, I think it's important to note that, like in Quebec, there was a kind of debate around after the massacre happened of like, oh, is this, because there was an analyst who said, well, the radio poubelle, the kind of the private right-wing radio stations in Quebec have blood on their hands, And then there was this whole debate about, oh, did Bissonnette actually listen to the radio or not, and so on and so forth. And it's all very academic because Bissonnette was part of a reading group that was led by some people who were basically notorious Islamophobes. These 2 guys, Eric Ambroise and Jérôme Gravel, Langlois, I think. And they're kind of minor characters in this kind of intellectual Islamophobic milieu. And so he'd been going to reading groups and hanging out with them, and he had all their other friends that were part of other kind of far right groups. So this is something that you see consistently, is that these mass shootings happen and are committed by people who have ties to the far right. They're not lone wolf actors ultimately. And I think that speaks to the violence that's at the heart of the fascist project. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you. So there's a question, and I said I'm going to try and get to two more questions, including this one. So we'll be mindful of the time. There's a question about that pandemics aren't going away because going away is because climate change is as a result of degradation of the environment and increasing overlap between human and non-human animal habitats. So I'm going to use this as a sort of a jumping off point because they're talking about like the way in which this can exacerbate tensions between left and right. And this has been, I think someone has alluded to this already today, so the precursor to the Freedom Convoy was, I think it was Rory that mentioned it, or Chelsea maybe, the United We Roll, the Yellow Vest Convoy 2019, which was motivated by the supposed anti-oil and gas policies of the Trudeau government. We can just sort of bracket off to the degree to which Trudeau actually cares about climate change. But in any case, and Tamara Lynch, one of the organizers of the Freedom Convoy, when she was arrested, she was wearing an I Heart Gas, Oil and Gas t-shirt. And there's lots of research done on the far right around the world. And clearly the overwhelming tendency amongst them is not towards eco-fascism, it's towards being very pro-fossil fuels and so on. And so it seems, following this person's question, that there could be a link, or maybe a necessary link, between like anti-fascist politics and organizing and climate justice politics and organizing. And so I'm wondering if any of our roundtable guests have any thoughts on the link, the possibility of those links, or the importance of those links in making it happen. And I see Rory's hand, and I'll just remind all of you, I really hope to get to one more quick question. So it's a bit unfair of me to pose a big question like that at this point, but you'll do your best. Rory.
Yeah, so I guess just to reiterate, yeah, there is like a sort of, I think, important direct organizational line between United We Roll, which was about the Trudeau government's supposed hatred of oil and gas, and the Freedom Convoy of this year, because you often saw the issue of like carbon taxes and other like climate change stuff was part of the larger messaging of the Freedom Rally, particularly at the Coutts blockade in Alberta. This was a big part of their messaging. And I think the sort of dislocation that has happened in Alberta to a lot of people who work in the oil industry as a result of like price downturns since 2014, and particularly as a result of the pandemic, there's a lot of anxiety here that kind of helps, that is like a sort of good point for the far right to organize around and like transform sort of their momentum from the anti-mandate stuff into questions around like fossil fuel transitions, and particularly like something I think Ed mentioned in a comment or question about this idea of like environmental mandates coming in or climate change mandates coming in. And this is something that the anti-vaxxers have like actually played up, is that actually this is just simply a taste of what is to come as like, you know, the evil globalists like impose all these sorts of climate mandates on us. And even the way that like this whole protest has like been around, like the sort of main vehicle for this has been like the automobile, like the truck and the private automobile, and its connection to like the infrastructure of fossil fuel production, I think is like very important to understand as like how the politics of these convoys connect to the issues of climate change. And that's something the left absolutely needs to organize around as well too, to talk better about just transitions for fossil fuel workers, to try and blunt the possible appeal of far right politics that say like, no, we should just oppose, like even perhaps even like violently oppose any kind of like attempt to do climate action.
Would anyone else like to comment on the?
Maybe just quickly, you know, some Green Party supporters were drawn into the anti-vaxxer convoy movement, and I think it's really important that we need to maybe point out some of the inconsistencies about the messages that Rory's been talking about going forward. I'm just cognizant July 1st is coming up, and that might be a flashpoint for some organizing for them, for the nationalism. Yeah.
Anyone else want to just add something quickly on the connection, climate justice organizing, which needs to be stronger, and anti-far right organizing that needs to be stronger? Nicholas.
I would just add to that last point that you know, I think that's one of the fault lines within the coalition that has been built by the far right with anti-vaxxers is there are a lot of Green Party people who have been brought along for the ride, you know, and I think it needs to be hammered home that you know, this is the leadership of the movement is definitely out of step with a good chunk of its base that has been mobilized, and that, you know, yeah, I think it's one of the weak points, and it needs to be brought forward, and I think, yeah, making this link with climate is absolutely crucial to doing that.
Great. I'll just note there's a book by Andreas Malm and the Clara Zetkin Collective called Black Fuel, White Race? I missed Black Fuel. I read it recently, sorry.
White Skin.
Black Fuel, White Skin by Andreas Malm, M-A-L-M. And then also a book that recently came out by Sam Moore and Alex Roberts called The Rise of Ecofascism, Climate Change in the Far Right. So Sam Moore, Alex Roberts, The Rise of Ecofascism. So one quick question for any of you who would like to respond to this. What are your thoughts on the strategy of anti-fascists being present outside of court proceedings when white supremacists, et cetera, are in court, and the person notes a upcoming appearance for a well-known Nazi in Ontario based out of Peterborough called Kevin Gaudreau, as well as some other folks. I'm not going to list all the names of the people who are in court for various like hate related stuff. So anyways, in terms of a tactic, do anyone have any thoughts on showing up outside courts when far right fascists are going into the court? Do you think it's a good idea? It's a good use of our resources? Oh, sorry, Rory, go ahead quickly.
I guess it would depend on what objective we're attempting. Like, in the context of where they're being, I guess, prosecuted for like stuff related to the convoy, I don't know. Like, I probably say it's better to focus resources on confronting them when they attempt to like do public rallies and so that their attempts to like occupy public space will not be uncontested. In terms of protesting outside of their trials and courthouses, it can run into issues around like bad press or like feelings that you might be attempting to influence like the legal process or something like that. If you have like a specific objective that you think would be accomplished by that, yeah, maybe, but I don't know.
MTS?
Yes, quickly, yeah, I think it gave me opportunity to use those court days as for myth breaking, to pointing out inconsistencies and things like that. And again, I think we, of course, confront them as they organize.
Great. Any last words before we wrap up this? We're just not going to be able to get to all the questions, and people have been really great sticking around for 2 hours. And so I apologize to anyone who's posted a question that they can't get to, but I don't know if Chelsea or Nick want to just add any last thing, since Antias and Rory responded to the last question. Chelsea, do you want to just add anything quickly?
Yeah, I think I saw some comments go by about recognizing the work that disability justice organizers are doing, and I would like to just underline and reiterate that the things I'm talking about isn't so much that everybody was doing nothing, but that there wasn't a broad mass movement around key issues, around paid sick days, things like that. And I say that now because the pandemic's not over. The numbers are, if you're looking at wastewater signals, the numbers are still pretty bad. There's still time to win these things. There's still time to do these things. But I also, it's been interesting. I work in labor. I am not a member myself, but there was other various labor groups that got involved in pushing back against the convoy. And I think that, it's kind of interesting when these moments happen, is that there's also like a lot of opinions out and about of like what labor should do. And it's uniquely positioned as the one movement that every other movement has opinions about what we should be doing. You're like, oh my God, have you ever spent time in the labor movement? I'd love for you to know the kinds of challenges we're dealing with, is that there were some unions that didn't want to send out the information about the counter events to their membership. I think in part because they'd already capitulated that space to the far right. They were afraid of their own members, reactionary comments supportive of the convoy. I think that that's really important to consider. If you're trying to oppose a convoy, but you haven't done a lot of work talking about anti-racism and talking about these kinds of things, then when you do step out in a crisis, maybe you're going to be in for a shock, and maybe can you weather that? Are you prepared to risk that? Some unions were, some unions weren't. And I think that if there's any sort of keys or pieces on how to engage labor, how to build relationships or get them involved in this kind of stuff, I think some of the only things I can share around that is, how do you approach labor? Who are you approaching? There's elected leadership, sort of at the president or that level, but then there's also district labor councils. If your city has one, you can email the president of the district labor council and ask them, hey, send this along to your locals. But you can also usually find all those locals listed online and send it yourself. It's kind of how many stopgaps we're running into. There's human rights committees. Usually a lot of unions have human rights committees. I know that PSAC, we have a queer human rights committee, racially visible members, Indigenous action, women's, and these are good spaces as well to start building relationships. Because those committees can ask for action within the structure of labor to say, hey, the Human Rights Committee, one of these wants to do something, get involved. So if the president is a bit reluctant, no, I don't want to do things, you can approach other avenues to kind of build these relationships and try to get some movement happening there. And building relationships is interesting too, right? Is that quite often sometimes it seems like folks are showing up asking for donations or asking for this and that, but it's, I think that there's a bit of a longer view there to have, and knowing what you're asking for too, like knowing, like, is it just, are we signing a statement? Are we doing this? Or do you have further asks around how to get involved? What does labor's involvement look like? And so I think that these are key ways. I just wanted to put it in because I wanted to put something out there about how to engage and work with labor along these lines. Thanks.
So we had Nicholas and then MTS, and it's 4 o'clock, so we're going to have to go very shortly. So Nicholas.
Yeah. I guess I just want to echo something, that Chelsea said earlier, which is that I think the left is kind of paying for the political quietism that we all kind of fell into over the last 2 years of the pandemic. It's really come to bite us in the ass, and we're having to play catch up now. And I think it means that the kind of anti-fascism that we need to build is not going to look like what the anti-fascism pre-pandemic looked like. I think one of the things we've seen is that the pandemic, like Chelsea said, is not going away. It's kind of like a structural shift in politics. And I think everyone was just kind of like sitting at home being like, okay, when's this going to be over so we can go back to normality? And it's not going to be like that. And I think the climate crisis will be similarly kind of destabilizing. And so I think, from my experience organizing with Quebec Solidaire around anti-racist work, I think I would say, like, one of the things we had to do when we brought this issue of the religious symbols and getting Quebec Solidaire to adopt an anti-racist position was we had to be able to say, look, be unwavering on the racism that was inherent in the whole debate about how Muslim women were somehow a threat to Quebec culture, And so we really had to be unwavering about that, while at the same time leaving the space for people who thought it was a good idea or agreed with these kind of restrictions to not just be like, you're a racist, and exclude them from the debate, because there were too many of them within the party to just do that. And so we actually had to find a way of having those discussions within the party, in a respectful way, but not giving up the critique of racism. And I think we're in a similar position with the Convoy, where we have to be unwavering in identifying the fascists that are at the top of this movement, while making the space for being like, we understand that people got frustrated and are fed up and got sucked up into this movement because there was nothing else, and having those difficult discussions. And we've tried to do it in the council to some degree. And I hope Labor starts doing those kinds of discussions with their members too, because it's not going to work to just say, well, you don't agree with, getting vaccinated, you must be a fascist, because it's not that simple. So I think we're in a complex terrain, but I think we're going to be able to move forward on this if we adopt new strategies.
MTS?
Yeah, I just want to thank everyone to bring us together, the panelists, for everybody joining and listening and so on. My message to you is get involved. We do need to organize, get involved with the Council of Canadians, with the Union PSAC, other organizations. We don't have funding our website is down, but you can find us on Facebook, Coalition Against Bigotry Pacific. Please like our page. Let's continue communicating and monitoring what's going on. They're watching us. We need to watch them, and we need to organize as well. Thank you so much.
Any very brief last words that you'd like to get in, Rory?
Yeah, basically, well, this sort of convoy has sort of somewhat gone away. Like, the issues that they've been organizing around have not, and to an extent the rallies, at least in Calgary, still continue. So if people in, either in Calgary or in any Canadian city, search out a group that is organizing against these far right groups and try and help out however you can. So obviously you can contact Community Solidarity Calgary. We're still doing things, but yeah, that's the main thing, just to reiterate. And also thanks for everyone else on this panel, and all the people who watching this.
Fantastic. So I want to thank our organizers and our sponsors. The links are in the chat for the various publications and podcasts that have sponsored this event or endorsed it. Thanks to everyone who's attended and for the various questions and comments that came forward. I apologize that I'm not able to get to them all. I did my best. And a special thanks to our roundtable participants, Imtiaz, Rory, Chelsea, and Nick. Hopefully this discussion has been helpful. The start of, or part of the start of our collective efforts to build a response, and a strong response, to the far right and its resurgence. And as it's obviously very clear, we have a lot of work to do. on this score, among others. But hopefully that will be something that will be encouragement and incentive for us to continue organizing and to get involved where those opportunities present themselves. And the video for this will eventually be posted online. So if you're here and you found this event useful, please share it as far and widely as possible. I guess we'll see you in an organizing meeting or on the streets sometime soon. And with that, take care, everyone, and have a good rest of your weekend. Bye-bye.